Rich neighbor called the cops on a black grandfather mowing a lawn. Then the property survey arrived. It was one of those mornings where the light falls soft and gold across a quiet street, the kind of morning where nothing seems capable of going wrong. Sprinklers ticked in the distance. A dog barked twice and then gave up. And in the middle of all that stillness, an elderly black man pushed an old lawn mower across a patch of overgrown grass, back and forth, slow and steady, the way a man moves when he has nowhere else he'd rather be. He wasn't in a hurry. He never was. His name doesn't matter yet. You'll understand why soon enough, but what matters is this. He had done this same walk across this same grass more times than anyone on that street could count. And not one person watching him that morning understood what was about to happen. Not one of them understood that in less than an hour, everything they thought they knew about this quiet neighborhood, about this man, and about the property lines that seemed so obvious was going to fall apart in front of them. Because across the street, behind a set of perfectly trimmed hedges and a driveway lined with 2 cars worth more than most people's homes, a man stood watching, and his face was changing. What had started as mild irritation was quickly curdling into something sharper. He set down his coffee. He straightened his shirt, and he began walking toward the sound of that mower like a man walking toward a fight he was sure he'd already won. "What do you think you're doing on my property?" The words cut through the morning air, loud enough that a neighbor 2 houses down looked up from her garden. The old man didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply turned off the mower, wiped his hands on his jeans, and answered in a voice so calm it almost didn't match the moment at all. "I'm just taking care of the land." That was it, no explanation, no argument, just those 7 words delivered the way you'd tell someone the time of day. And somehow that calm made the rich man across from him even angrier. Because arrogance doesn't know what to do with peace, it only knows how to escalate. Without another word, the wealthy neighbor pulled out his phone and called the police. Word spreads fast on a quiet street. Within minutes, curtains were twitching. A jogger slowed to a stop at the corner. Someone's teenage son leaned out of an upstairs window with his phone already recording. And through all of it, through the stares, the whispers, the judgment forming in real time, the old man simply stood beside his mower, hands folded, waiting. He didn't argue with anyone. He didn't try to convince the crowd of anything. He just waited, the way a man waits when he already knows something the rest of the world hasn't figured out yet. And somewhere in that stillness, a single line settled over the whole scene like a held breath. 40 minutes. That's all it would take. 40 minutes before a set of small metal survey markers, hammered into the ground by strangers with clipboards and measuring wheels, would silence an entire neighborhood and turn every assumption in that crowd completely upside down. But to understand how any of this happened, how a man mowing an empty lawn on a Tuesday morning ended up at the center of a police call, a property dispute, and a truth nobody saw coming, you have to go back. Not far. Just far enough to understand who this man really was and why he never once considered walking away. He'd lived in that neighborhood longer than almost anyone else on the street. Long before the new houses went up, long before the property values climbed and the driveways filled with cars that cost more than a teacher's yearly salary. He was a widower, had been for a few years now, and he lived simply, the way people do when the noise of accumulating things stops mattering as much as it once did. Some of the older folks remembered that he'd spent decades in the classroom, teaching history to kids who are grown now with children of their own. Others swore he'd worn a uniform once years before that, back when the whole street was nothing but empty lots and hope. Whichever version you heard, one thing stayed the same in every telling. This was a man who showed up. When someone's fence blew over in a storm, he was the first one out there with a hammer. When a young mother down the street had her car break down on a freezing morning, he was the one who sat with her until the tow truck came, just so she wasn't standing there alone. And when the lot next to his house sat empty and overgrown for longer than anyone could remember, he simply started mowing it. Not because it was his job, not because anyone paid him. He mowed it because an empty lot left untended becomes an eyesore, and an eyesore becomes a reason for people to stop caring about where they live. He never wanted that for this street. Children who grew up on that block didn't know him as anything other than the kind old man who waved from his porch every morning. Parents trusted him instinctively, the way you trust someone whose actions have never once given you a reason not to. If you'd asked anyone on that street before that morning to name the person they respected most in the neighborhood, more than half of them would have said his name without hesitation. which is exactly why what happened next felt so wrong to so many people, even before they understood the full story. The man who called the police that morning hadn't lived there long. Just under a year, in fact, in the biggest house on the block, the one with the circular driveway and the security cameras mounted on every corner like the house itself was daring anyone to come near it. He'd made his money somewhere else, somewhere far from this quiet street, and he carried that money with him everywhere he went, like it was a badge that entitled him to something more than everyone around him. From nearly the day he moved in, there had been complaints, not from him about him. He'd called code enforcement over a neighbor's fence that was 2 inches taller than he thought it should be. He'd left angry notes about a car parked slightly over an invisible line only he seemed to notice. He'd complained about a dog barking at 7 a.m., about music at a birthday party that ended at 8 p.m., about a basketball hoop he claimed was aesthetically inappropriate for the street. Little by little, people had stopped inviting him to anything, not out of spite, just exhaustion. He believed in some deep and unshakable way that money bought more than comfort. He believed it bought authority, that if his name was on enough paperwork, if his house was big enough and his lawyer fast enough on speed dial, then whatever he decided was true simply became true. And when he looked across the street that morning and saw an old black man calmly mowing a patch of grass he'd convinced himself belonged to him, he didn't see a neighbor. He saw a problem to be corrected. So when the 2 officers pulled up, lights not flashing, just parked at the curb the way they do for a call that doesn't sound urgent, the wealthy neighbor was already waiting for them with his arms crossed and his story fully rehearsed. "He's trespassing," he told them, pointing at the old man like he was identifying a stranger instead of someone who had lived on that street since before the officer's own house was built. "That's my property. He has no right to be there." A small crowd had gathered by then, neighbors stepping out onto porches, phones raised, whispers passing quietly from person to person. And in that crowd, doubt was already doing its quiet, dangerous work. A few people who knew the old man well enough to know better still found themselves unsure. That's what confidence does, even when it's built on nothing. It convinces people around it before it's even proven itself. One of the officers, young, still finding his footing in moments like this, turned to the old man and asked the question everyone was waiting to hear. "Sir, do you have permission to be here?" And once again that same steady calm. "I've taken care of this land for years." No anger, no raised voice. Just quiet dignity standing there in the middle of a crowd that hadn't yet decided whose side to take. It would have been easy in that moment for this story to go the way so many stories like it have gone before. A man judged before he was heard. A crowd ready to believe the loudest voice instead of the truest one. But something small started happening, something almost nobody noticed at first. The old man began speaking, quietly, almost to himself, about details that made no sense to anyone standing there. He mentioned an oak tree, said it used to stand right where the rich man's mailbox now sat, tall and wide enough that kids used to climb it before a storm took it down years ago. He pointed toward a patch of grass near the property's edge, and said there used to be a stone marker there, half buried now, that the original owners had placed decades earlier to mark exactly where their land ended. He spoke about a family who had lived on that lot long before any of the current houses existed, a family whose name most people on that street had never even heard. Nobody understood in that moment why any of it mattered. A crowd formed around confusion instead of certainty now. Why would a man accused of trespassing know more about this land's history than the man who supposedly owned it? Why would he speak with such quiet confidence about details that had nothing to do with defending himself and everything to do with simply remembering? It was the kind of detail that doesn't answer a question. It only creates a new one, and that question sat there, unanswered, humming underneath everything that happened next. The wealthy neighbor, sensing the shift in the crowd, reached for the one thing he was sure would end this once and for all: his paperwork. He marched into his house and returned minutes later with a folder, official-looking, filled with property documents he waved in front of the officers like a trump card finally being played. "It's all right here," he said. "Clear as day, this is my land." The officers looked over the documents. On the surface, everything seemed to line up exactly the way he claimed. Numbers, boundaries, a legal description that matched his address. For a moment, the crowd's sympathy began to lean back in his direction. Maybe the old man really had made a mistake. Maybe kindness alone wasn't enough to override a signed piece of paper. But then one of the officers, an older one, the kind who'd worked this town long enough to know that paperwork and reality don't always agree, leaned in closer to the document. He read it a second time, then a third. His eyebrows drew together. "This description," he said slowly, almost to himself, "doesn't match what's actually out here." He looked up at the old oak stump barely visible in the grass. He looked at the half-buried stone marker the old man had pointed to earlier. He looked at the fence line separating the two properties, a fence that had clearly been there for years, maybe even decades, but that suddenly seemed to be sitting in a strange, slightly wrong position compared to what the paperwork described. "Maybe," the officer said carefully, "we should verify the boundary before anyone gets arrested here." The wealthy neighbor rolled his eyes, visibly annoyed at the delay, certain this was nothing more than an inconvenient formality standing between him and being proven right in front of an audience. He had no idea, standing there in his driveway with his arms crossed, that he was about to lose far more than an argument. A licensed survey crew arrived a little over an hour later. Two men and a woman stepped out of a plain white truck, unloading equipment with the unhurried efficiency of people who had done this job 1,000 times before and had absolutely no stake in who was right. They set up a tripod near the property line. They rolled out a measuring wheel across the grass. Bright orange survey flags began appearing in the ground, one by one, planted with quiet precision exactly where the old paperwork said the boundary should be, and exactly where the physical evidence on the ground suggested it might not be. The crowd, which had been buzzing with conversation just minutes earlier, grew unusually quiet. There's something about watching professionals measure the truth that makes people stop talking. Nobody wanted to miss whatever was about to be said. The wealthy neighbor stood near the flags with his arms crossed, a tight, confident smile still on his face, the kind of smile that hadn't yet realized it was about to be wrong. The old man, meanwhile, stood off to the side, hands folded, watching the surveyors work with the calm patience of someone who already knew, deep down, exactly what they were going to find. It took the lead surveyor almost 20 minutes to finish his measurements. He crouched near one of the flags, checked something on a tablet, walked several feet, checked again, then finally stood up and pulled out an old folded document from his bag, comparing it line by line against the readings on his screen. County records, original plots, the kind of paperwork that doesn't care about anyone's confidence or anyone's driveway or anyone's bank account. When he finally turned back toward the small crowd, his voice was calm, almost apologetic, the way people speak when they know the truth they're about to deliver is going to change everything. "The fence," he said, "was built in the wrong location. Years ago, from what I can tell. Whoever put it up must have made an honest mistake or maybe just assumed where the line was without checking. But according to the original county survey, this fence sits almost 11 feet onto the neighboring lot." He pointed toward the exact patch of grass the old man had been mowing that morning. "This section right here," he continued, "the lawn everyone's been standing around arguing about, it isn't part of this property at all." For a moment, nobody said anything. The wealthy neighbor's smile didn't disappear all at once. It faded slowly, the way confidence does when it finally meets a fact it can't argue with. He looked at the flags. He looked at the paperwork in his own hands, suddenly feeling much less official than it had 10 minutes earlier. He looked at the old man who hadn't moved, hadn't gloated, hadn't said a single word since the surveyor started speaking. The realization landed on him slowly, then all at once. He had never actually owned the land he'd been so certain belonged to him. Every angry phone call, every accusation, every moment of feeling entitled enough to summon the police over a patch of grass. All of it had been built on a boundary that was never real to begin with. And still, the crowd wasn't finished learning the truth, because there was still one question hanging in the air, the one that had been building since the very beginning of that morning. Why did this man know so much about this land? Why did he know about the oak tree, the stone marker, the family who lived there before any of this street existed? The answer came quietly, the way most real answers do. Years earlier, before that lot sat empty and overgrown, an elderly woman had owned it. She'd been a friend of his, one of the few people left on that street who remembered the neighborhood before it had a name that meant anything to real estate agents. When her health began to fail and she could no longer care for the land herself, she asked him for one simple favor. Not money, not paperwork, just his word. "Keep it looking cared for," she told him. "Until everything gets sorted out properly, promise me that." And he did. He gave her his word, the kind of promise that doesn't come with paperwork or deadlines, the kind you keep simply because you said you would. She passed away not long after, and the legal process of transferring her land dragged on in the slow, tangled way these things sometimes do, buried under county offices and distant relatives and years passing quietly by. But his promise never expired. So every week for years, long before the wealthy neighbor ever moved onto that street, this man had shown up and mowed that lawn. Not because anyone was watching, not because anyone was keeping score. He did it because he'd given his word, and because he believed, quietly and completely, that this neighborhood deserved to look like people still cared about it. The survey didn't create that truth. It only uncovered what had been true the entire time. By the time all of this settled over the crowd, something had shifted in the air completely. The officers who had arrived ready to make an arrest now stood a little differently, a little more humbled. One of them walked over and apologized directly, admitting they'd almost let confidence outweigh the evidence. Several neighbors who had whispered doubts about the old man earlier that morning found themselves quietly ashamed of how quickly they'd been ready to believe the wrong version of events. And the wealthy neighbor, the one who had marched across the street with such certainty just over an hour earlier, stood frozen, holding a folder full of paperwork that no longer meant what he thought it meant. But here's the part that surprised almost everyone standing there. The old man didn't gloat. He didn't demand an apology. He didn't even bring up the police call, the accusations, or the humiliation of being surrounded by strangers questioning whether he belonged on land he'd cared for longer than most of them had lived on that street. He simply walked back to his mower and started it again. A young boy in the crowd, maybe 8 or 9 years old, tugged on his mother's sleeve and asked the question that seemed to be sitting on everyone's mind. Why isn't he angry? The old man must have heard him because he looked over, and for the first time that whole morning, he smiled. Grass doesn't care who argues over it, he said. It still needs someone willing to care for it. And with that, he finished the job he'd started hours earlier, pushing the mower calmly across the very same patch of land that had almost gotten him arrested that morning. Weeks passed. The story of that morning spread through the neighborhood the way stories like it always do, quietly at first, then everywhere all at once. But what changed the street wasn't the gossip. It was what happened to that empty lot afterward. Instead of sitting forgotten at the edge of 2 properties, it slowly became something else entirely. Neighbors who had stood silently watching that morning, unsure of what to believe, started showing up on weekends with shovels and seed packets. What had once been an overgrown patch of grass became a small community garden, tended by people who had learned, in the most uncomfortable way possible, what it looks like when someone quietly does the right thing for years without ever asking for credit. And perhaps the most surprising part of all, the wealthy neighbor joined them. He didn't say much at first. He mostly just showed up, awkward and unsure of his place among people he'd spent a year alienating with complaints and assumptions. But he kept coming back. And one Saturday morning, the old man walked over to him without a hint of resentment on his face and handed him a pair of gardening gloves. No lecture, no mention of the police, the accusations, or the survey that had exposed everything. Just gloves handed over the way you'd offer something to a neighbor because that's exactly what he still was. There was no revenge in that moment, only growth, quite literally rising up out of ground that had once been the center of so much anger and misunderstanding. Because in the end, this story was never really about a fence, or a lawn, or even a wealthy man's misplaced confidence. It was about something far simpler and far harder to measure with any tape measure or survey equipment. Property can be measured with stakes and flags and old county paperwork. But character, the kind that shows up quietly, keeps its promises, and stays calm even when the whole world seems ready to believe the wrong thing about you, that can only be measured by what a person does when no one is watching at all. And on that quiet street, for years, someone had been watching all along. It just took one property survey for everyone else to finally see it too.